On the evening of the 11th of March, 1938, Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg sat before a microphone, his voice heavy as it carried over the nation's airwaves. He announced he was yielding to force to prevent the spilling of German blood and closed his broadcasts with a desperate, heartbreaking plea: Gott schütze Österreich, God save Austria. Within hours, he would be a prisoner and his country would be erased from the map. The event known as the Anschluss, the union of Austria with Germany, was not a spontaneous occurrence. It was the culmination of decades of complex history, ideology, and the singular, obsessive ambition of one man, Adolf Hitler. Austria, the small republic that emerged from the ashes of the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire after the First World War, was a state born in trauma and economic hardship. The 1919 Treaty of Saint-Germain, the sister treaty to Versailles, had dismantled the empire, leaving behind a rump state of 6.5 million people, with its imperial capital, Vienna, now a head far too large for its shrunken body. Crucially, Article 88 of the treaty explicitly forbade this new republic from uniting with the new German Republic. The victors of the Great War, particularly France, were determined to prevent the emergence of an even larger, more powerful Germany. This prohibition, however, ran counter to powerful currents of identity. Many Austrians, particularly outside of Red Vienna, saw themselves as fundamentally German. The slogan "German Austria," the state's initial name before the Allies forced a change, reflected this sentiment. The idea of a Großdeutschland, a greater Germany encompassing all German-speaking peoples, had been a potent dream for a century. For Adolf Hitler, born in the Austrian border town of Braunau am Inn, this was not just policy, it was destiny. In the very first sentence of his 1925 manifesto, Mein Kampf, he declared, "German Austria must be restored to the great German motherland. People of the same blood should be in the same Reich." The Austria of the 1932 was a deeply divided nation, trapped between the political extremes, convulsing Europe. The Social Democrats, with their stronghold in Vienna, clashed violently with the conservative, clerical Christian Social Party and the various right-wing nationalist militias, chief among them the Heimwehr. In 1933, the Christian Social Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss seized upon a parliamentary crisis to suspend the constitution, effectively ending Austrian democracy. He established an authoritarian, corporatist state modeled on Italian fascism, known as the Ständestaat. Dollfuss, allied with Benito Mussolini's Italy, was determined to keep Austria independent, especially from the new menacing Nazi regime in Germany. The Austrian Nazi Party, however, was a powerful and destabilizing force, funded and directed from Berlin. They saw Dollfuss as a traitor to the German cause. On the 25th of July, 1934, in a failed coup attempt known as the July Putsch, Austrian SS members stormed the chancellery in Vienna and assassinated Engelbert Dollfuss. He was left to bleed to death on a sofa. The putsch failed, largely because Italy, then the guarantor of Austrian independence, rushed troops to the Brenner Pass, signaling to Hitler that Germany, at that time still militarily weak, should back down. Hitler disavowed the coup, but the message was clear. The fight for Austria was a fight to the death. Succeeding Dollfuss was his Minister of Justice, Kurt von Schuschnigg. He was an austere, intellectual, monarchist-leaning lawyer, deeply pious and equally committed to Austrian independence. He continued Dollfuss's authoritarian rule, governing through his Fatherland Front, the only legal political organization. He imprisoned opponents on both the left and the right, trying to navigate an impossible path. His protection, like that of his predecessor, depended entirely on the patronage of Benito Mussolini. But the diplomatic landscape of Europe was shifting. In 1935, Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, pushed him into international isolation. Condemned by Britain and France at the League of Nations, he found his only significant support came from Hitler's Germany. The Stresa Front, an anti-German alliance of Britain, France, and Italy, collapsed. The price of German support was Mussolini's acquiescence on Austria. This new reality was formalized with the Rome-Berlin axis in October 1936. Austria's protector had become its predator's partner. Hitler, sensing this shift, moved to normalize relations with Austria, biding his time. On the 11th of July, 1936, the two nations signed the Gentleman's Agreement. On the surface, it seemed a victory for Schuschnigg. Germany recognized Austria's full sovereignty. In return, Austria acknowledged itself as a German state and agreed to align its foreign policy with Germany's. A secret clause, however, was the poison pill. Schuschnigg agreed to grant amnesty to imprisoned Nazis and to bring national figures into his government, effectively Trojan horses for the Third Reich. The pressure began to mount immediately. The national opposition, now legitimized, grew bolder. Austrian Nazis, led by figures like Arthur Seyss-Inquart, a quiet, bespectacled lawyer with deep Nazi sympathies, began to infiltrate state institutions. Schuschnigg was walking a tightrope, trying to appease Berlin without surrendering his country. The true timetable for Austria's demise was set on the 5th of November, 1937, in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. In a secret meeting, later documented as the Hossbach Memorandum, Hitler outlined his irreversible intentions to his top military commanders. He declared his need to solve Germany's space problem and stated that his first objectives would be the annexation of Austria and the destruction of Czechoslovakia. He planned to act by 1943 at the latest, but sooner if opportunities, such as a French Civil War, arose. Austria was officially living on borrowed time. The opportunity Hitler needed came not from France, but from Austria itself. In late January 1938, Austrian police, loyal to Schuschnigg, raided the Vienna headquarters of the Committee of Seven, a supposedly independent nationalist group. They uncovered a trove of documents, including the Tavs Plan, named after its author, the Austrian Nazi Leopold Tavs. It was a detailed blueprint for a Nazi-led uprising, timed for the spring, which would be used as a pretext for the German army to intervene and restore order. Schuschnigg believed he finally had the leverage he needed. He had proof of German interference and internal subversion. He decided to confront Hitler, but Hitler, informed of the police raid by his spies in Vienna, seized the initiative. He feigned outrage at the persecution of Austrian nationalists and, through his envoy Franz von Papen, summoned Schuschnigg to his mountain retreat, the Berghof, at Berchtesgaden. On the morning of the 12th of February, 1938, Kurt von Schuschnigg's car climbed the icy road to the Obersalzberg. He had been explicitly told to come alone, without his usual advisors, though he brought his foreign minister, Guido Schmidt. He was met at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain residence, not with diplomatic courtesy, but with calculated intimidation. A phalanx of SS guards lined the steps. Inside, Hitler was waiting, flanked by his top generals, including Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the new Armed Forces High Command, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or OKW. The military presence was a blatant, silent threat. The meeting was not a negotiation. It was a dressing down. Hitler began a monologue that lasted for hours, a torrent of historical grievances and personal insults. He accused Austria of betraying its German character. He berated Schuschnigg for his attempts to maintain an independent course, calling Austria's very existence high treason. He ridiculed Schuschnigg's miserable army and his reliance on foreign powers. "I have only to give an order," Hitler shouted, "and in a single night you will all be overrun." He warned that the Spanish Civil War could be child's play compared to what he would unleash. Schuschnigg, pale but composed, tried to interject, to speak of the 1936 agreement. Hitler cut him off. "We are not here to talk about the weather," he sneered. He presented Schuschnigg with a typed 2-page ultimatum. The demands were a death warrant for Austrian sovereignty. First, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Trojan horse, was to be appointed Minister of the Interior and Security, giving him total control over all Austrian police and security forces. Second, all imprisoned Nazis were to be granted a full and immediate amnesty. Third, the Austrian Nazi Party was to be effectively legalized, integrated into the Fatherland Front. Hitler gave Schuschnigg until the afternoon to consider. The Austrian Chancellor was left alone in a room with German generals, who spoke casually of the Wehrmacht's power. Schuschnigg knew he was trapped. He had no support. Mussolini had been informed of the meeting but offered no help. Britain and France were distant abstractions. At 5 p.m., he was brought back to Hitler. He stated that while he, as Chancellor, could not sign a document binding his country, he would personally guarantee to bring the terms to his president, Wilhelm Miklas, for implementation within the 3-day deadline Hitler had set. Hitler, sensing victory, snapped, "You will sign it, and you will carry it out." Schuschnigg, defeated, signed. As he left, Hitler said, "I can only advise you to take this matter very seriously." Schuschnigg returned to Vienna a broken man. He and President Miklas, a stubborn but ultimately powerless figure, saw no choice but to comply. On the 16th of February 1938, a new Austrian cabinet was sworn in. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the man who took his orders directly from Berlin, was now in control of Austria's police. The Brown Flood was unleashed. Almost immediately, the national opposition that Schuschnigg had tried to co-opt was supplanted by the hardcore, radical Austrian Nazis. They poured out of the jails, emboldened and arrogant. Swastika flags, previously banned, began to appear, first tentatively, then in open defiance. In Graz, the capital of Styria, local Nazis effectively seized control of the city. Street brawls with Fatherland, front supporters, and police became commonplace. But the police, now under Seyss-Inquart's command, were ordered not to intervene against the Nazis. Austria was rapidly descending into chaos, a chaos orchestrated from Berlin and implemented by its new Minister of the Interior. From his office in Berlin, Hermann Göring, Hitler's second-in-command, began to manage the crisis directly. He was in constant telephone contact with Seyss-Inquart, pushing him to be more aggressive, to create more incidents, to make Austria ungovernable. Schuschnigg, watching his country dissolve, felt the walls closing in. He received reports from his provincial governors, one after another, describing a complete breakdown of law and order. In this desperate situation, Schuschnigg decided on one final desperate gamble. He would call Hitler's bluff. He would bypass the politicians and the generals and appeal directly to the Austrian people. He would prove, once and for all, that the majority of Austrians did not want to be part of Hitler's Germany. On the evening of Wednesday, the 9th of March 1938, in a fiery speech in Innsbruck, Schuschnigg made a stunning impromptu announcement. He was calling a national plebiscite, a referendum on Austrian independence, to be held in just 4 days, on Sunday, March 13. The question on the ballot was a direct challenge to the Nazi narrative. For a free and German, independent and social, for a Christian and united Austria, for peace and work and the equality of all who profess loyalty to our people and fatherland. To further tilt the odds, he raised the minimum voting age to 24, effectively disenfranchising the large cohort of young, radicalized Nazi supporters. The announcement hit Berlin like a thunderbolt. Hitler was caught completely by surprise, and he was enraged. He had been planning to absorb Austria through a process of evolution, a gradual hollowing out of its sovereignty by Seyss-Inquart. Schuschnigg's plebiscite threatened to expose this strategy. Worse, Hitler could not be certain of the outcome. Even if he won, a 60-40 or 70-30 split would be a public relations disaster, destroying the myth of a unanimous desire for union. He was not a man who tolerated risks he did not control. On the morning of March 10, Hitler gave the order. The plebiscite could not be allowed to happen. He instructed his generals to finalize Operation Otto, the code name for the military invasion of Austria. The plan was rudimentary, drawn up years before, and largely forgotten. The Wehrmacht, still in the process of rebuilding, was not truly prepared for a major campaign. General Heinz Guderian, the pioneer of tank warfare, was ordered to assemble his panzer units, but the entire operation was one of improvisation. Tanks were pulled from parade grounds and training centers. Fuel and maps were in short supply. But the order was absolute. The invasion was set for Saturday, March 12. Simultaneously, the political offensive began, run not by Hitler, but by Hermann Göring from the Reich Air Ministry. The afternoon of March 10 and the entirety of March 11 were a relentless, escalating storm of telephone diplomacy, threats, and ultimatums, all directed at Vienna. Göring was in his element, bullying, cajoling, and lying to his counterparts. His first demand, relayed to Schuschnigg via Seyss-Inquart and the German military attaché, was simple. The plebiscite must be postponed. Schuschnigg, realizing his gamble had triggered the very invasion it was meant to prevent, spent the morning of March 11 inches a frantic search for support. He cabled London, appealing to the British government. The response from Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was a polite but firm refusal to offer any guarantees. He cabled Paris. The French government, coincidentally, was in the midst of collapsing and could offer nothing. His last, frailest hope was Italy. He appealed to Mussolini, the man who had saved Austria in 1934. But this was 1938. Mussolini was now Hitler's junior partner. Hitler had dispatched his own envoy, Prince Philip of Hesse, to Rome with a personal, handwritten letter for the Duce, explaining his purely defensive actions. When Mussolini received Schuschnigg's plea, he sent word back to Berlin that Austria was a matter of indifference to him. When Prince Philip relayed this message to Hitler by phone, the Führer was famously ecstatic, shouting, "Tell Mussolini I will never forget him for this! Never, never, never!" The last diplomatic barrier had fallen. In Vienna, Schuschnigg was alone. At 2 p.m. on March 11, under threat of an immediate German invasion, he agreed to Göring's first demand. He canceled the plebiscite. He hoped this would be enough. It was not. Göring, having tasted blood, immediately escalated. Within minutes, he was back on the phone to his agents in Vienna. The new demand, canceling the plebiscite, was insufficient. To restore confidence between the two nations, Schuschnigg himself must resign, and he must be replaced as Chancellor by Arthur Seyss-Inquart. He gave them a deadline of 7:30 p.m. The Austrian cabinet met in the Chancellery on the Ballhausplatz. The mood was funeral. Schuschnigg was prepared to resign to avoid bloodshed, but President Wilhelm Miklas, a man of stubborn, legalistic principle, refused. He would accept Schuschnigg's resignation, but he would not, under any circumstances, appoint Seyss-Inquart as Chancellor. It was a violation of the Austrian constitution. As the deadline approached, the Chancellery was in chaos. Göring, back on the phone, was now apoplectic. He was recorded screaming at a German envoy in Vienna, "The resignation is not enough. Seyss-Inquart must be given the chancellorship. He must be appointed. Tell Miklas that if we are not informed by 7:30, then the action will take its course, and that will be the end of it." At 7:30 p.m., the deadline passed. Miklas had not yielded. Göring, in a moment of cynical genius, decided to manufacture the pretext he needed. He ordered Seyss-Inquart to send a telegram to Berlin, formally requesting that Germany send troops to help the new Austrian government restore order and tranquility. Seyss-Inquart, in a panic, refused. There was no new government, and there was no disorder, other than that caused by his own Nazis. Göring did not care. He simply bypassed him. At 8:48 p.m., the German news bureau released the text of a telegram that Seyss-Inquart had supposedly sent. It was a fabrication, written by Göring himself. The provisional Austrian government, it read, sends its urgent request to the German government to support it in its task of maintaining peace and order. In the meantime, Schuschnigg had made his decision. He would not fight. He had ordered the Austrian army not to resist any German advance. At 7:47 p.m., he went to the radio studio in the Chancellery. In a voice cracking with emotion, he delivered his famous, brief farewell address. He informed the Austrian people of the German ultimatum, of the threat of invasion, and of his decision to yield to force. "We are not prepared, even in this terrible situation, to spill German blood," he declared. He ended with the words that would echo as the epitaph for the First Austrian Republic, Gott schütze Österreich. Across Vienna, the broadcast was met with stunned silence, then tears and panic. For the city's 190,000 Jews, it was a signal of profound existential terror. For the Austrian Nazis, it was the signal for celebration. They poured into the streets, ripping the red, white, red flag from public buildings and raising the swastika. In the Chancellery, President Miklos continued his lonely, futile resistance for a few more hours. But with the German invasion now a certainty, he finally buckled. At 11:15 p.m., he formally appointed Arthur Seyss-Inquart as the new Chancellor of Austria. It was a hollow victory. At 9:10 p.m., nearly 2 hours earlier, Hitler had already given the final, irrevocable order for Operation Otto. The invasion, justified by a fabricated telegram from a man who was not yet in power, was already in motion. At dawn on Saturday, the 12th of March, 1938, units of the German Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and the SS crossed the Austrian border at multiple points. There was no resistance. The Austrian army, following Schuschnigg's last order, remained in its barracks. The border posts were lifted, and the German soldiers were met not with gunfire, but with flowers, cheers, and waving crowds. The invasion became a triumphal procession, a Blumenkrieg, or War of Flowers. The scenes were ones of genuine, ecstatic welcome in many places, particularly in the provincial towns. Years of economic hardship, national humiliation, and propaganda had done their work. The sight of German troops, tanks, and armored cars was, for many, a symbol of strength, order, and the long-awaited fulfillment of the Großdeutschland dream. But the invasion was, from a military perspective, a logistical fiasco. The German General Staff, which had opposed the hurried operation, was proven correct. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Division, the elite spearhead, sputtered to a halt on the road to Linz. Not from enemy action, but from a catastrophic lack of fuel. The roads were clogged with a chaotic mix of military vehicles, civilian cars, and buses full of celebrating supporters. General Guderian later wrote that the operation revealed grave faults in the Wehrmacht's organization. It was a crucial and deeply worrying lesson for the German High Command, one they would work feverishly to correct before their next campaign. Adolf Hitler, meanwhile, ignored the logistical chaos. He followed his troops, crossing the border of his homeland at Braunau am Inn, his birthplace. He was deeply moved visiting his parents' grave in the nearby village of Leonding. His original plan had been to install Seyss-Inquart as the head of a satellite state, a national Austria aligned with Germany, much like Slovakia would later become. But the sheer, overwhelming, and seemingly unanimous joy of the crowds he encountered changed his mind. He arrived in Linz, the capital of his home province, to a hysterical reception. That evening, standing on the balcony of the town hall, flanked by Seyss-Inquart and Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, Hitler addressed the cheering throng. He spoke of providence, of a divine mission. The ecstatic response convinced him there was no need for a two-state solution. The time for a full, immediate union, the Anschluss, had come. The next day, March 13, as Hitler's motorcade continued its triumphal, traffic-snarled journey towards Vienna, the legal framework for Austria's destruction was finalized. Seyss-Inquart, now a mere functionary in Hitler's entourage, signed the law regarding the reunification of Austria with the German Reich. Article 1 stated simply, Austria is a land of the German Reich. The Republic of Austria, its constitution, its flag, and its name ceased to exist. It was absorbed into Germany, its provinces reorganized into a new administrative unit that would soon be known as Ostmark, the Eastern March. On March 14, Hitler arrived in Vienna, the city where he had spent his youth as a failed artist and bitter vagrant. He now returned as its conqueror. He stayed at the Imperial Hotel, the same hotel where Schuschnigg was now being held under house arrest, one floor above, before his long journey to concentration camps at Dachau and Sachsenhausen. The following day, March 15, was the climax. From the grand balcony of the Hofburg Palace, the ancient seat of the Habsburg emperors, Hitler addressed a crowd of over 200,000 jammed into the Heldenplatz, the Heroes' Square. As Führer and Chancellor of the German nation and the Reich, he proclaimed, his voice rising to a roar, "I announce to German history the entry of my homeland into the German Reich." The Anschluss was complete. But beneath the surface of the cheering crowds and the Blumenkrieg, a different, far darker reality had taken hold, beginning the very moment Schuschnigg's farewell broadcast ended. The Anschluss Pogrom, as it came to be known, was an explosion of violence, greed, and sadism, unparalleled in its suddenness and ferocity. It was, as the historian Ian Kershaw wrote, a vortex of terror. On Hitler's heels, and in some cases preceding him, had come the instruments of the Nazi police state. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, and Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Security Service, or SD, arrived in Vienna on March 12. They brought with them their arrest lists, meticulously prepared. Within days, 70,000 Austrians were arrested. The targets were not just Jews, but also Schuschnigg's Fatherland Front supporters, Social Democrats, communists, intellectuals, artists, and anyone deemed an enemy of the state. For Austria's Jewish population, the descent into hell was immediate. The long-brewing anti-Semitism of Vienna, a city where Hitler had first absorbed his prejudices, erupted with savage force. This was not yet the cold, bureaucratic extermination of the Holocaust, but a hot, personal, and public humiliation. The most infamous ritual was the Reibpartien, the scrubbing parties. Jewish men and women, often professionals, doctors, lawyers, and professors, were dragged from their homes by brown shirts of the Sturmabteilung, or SA, and their own gleeful neighbors. They were forced onto their hands and knees, given scrubbing brushes, and sometimes toothbrushes, in order to scrub anti-Nazi slogans or political graffiti from the city's pavements. As they worked, crowds gathered to jeer, spit, and kick them. These were not faceless SS men from Germany. These were the local janitors, shopkeepers, and housewives of Vienna. Homes and businesses were looted in a wave of wild Aryanization. SA men and opportunistic civilians simply walked into Jewish apartments and shops, declared them confiscated, and threw the owners into the street. The police, now under SS control, looked on or actively participated. In the first few weeks after the Anschluss, a wave of suicides swept the Viennese Jewish community. Desperate people, seeing their world, their property, and their dignity destroyed overnight, saw no other escape. This brutal, chaotic pogrom was so extreme that it even concerned the Nazi leadership, not for its inhumanity, but for its inefficiency. Heydrich and his subordinate Adolf Eichmann soon arrived to systematize the terror. Eichmann, then a little-known SS functionary, set up the Central Office for Jewish Emigration in Vienna. It was here he perfected his bureaucratic methods of terror, streamlining the process of stripping Jews of all their wealth and property in exchange for an exit visa. The Vienna model of forced emigration would become the blueprint for the final solution. The international reaction to this dismemberment of a sovereign European state was muted, fragmented, and ultimately meaningless. The Anschluss was a test of the world's resolve, and the world failed utterly. In London, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain addressed the House of Commons. He expressed profound regret and called the German action deplorable. But he was a realist. He had been advised by his ambassador to Berlin, Neville Henderson, that the Anschluss was, in the long run, inevitable. Lord Halifax, his foreign secretary, had even told Hitler months earlier that Britain would not necessarily oppose alterations in the European settlement regarding Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Danzig, so long as they were achieved by peaceful evolution. While Hitler's methods were crude, the underlying principle of German self-determination seemed, to many in the British establishment, to be a reasonable, if unfortunate, correction of the injustices of Versailles. Britain lodged a formal protest, which Germany ignored. In Paris, the reaction was paralyzed by internal chaos. The entire French government of Camille Chautemps had resigned on March 10, the day the crisis began. France was without a government for the most crucial days. When a new government was finally formed under Léon Blum, it was too late. France, deeply divided, politically unstable, and terrified of another war, could do nothing without its British ally. It, too, lodged a protest. In Washington, the United States, deep in its isolationist slumber, was even more detached. The administration of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, constrained by a Neutrality Act, issued a mild statement condemning the extinction of Austria and the method of force. There was no talk of sanctions or action. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, was perhaps the only power to register the strategic danger. Foreign Minister Maxim Litvinov issued a sharp condemnation and called for an emergency conference of the other great powers to discuss a collective response to aggression. His proposal was dismissed by London and Paris as a premature and provocative diplomatic maneuver. Hitler, having faced down the world, now moved to legitimize his conquest. On the 10th of April, 1938, he held a plebiscite of his own, this time for both Germany and the newly absorbed Austria. The campaign was a masterpiece of propaganda, orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels. It was not a vote, it was an acclamation of a fact. Hitler, Cardinal Theodor Innitzer of Vienna, and other prominent figures urged a yes vote. The ballot itself was a study in manipulation. The circle for Ja, S, was massive and centered, while the circle for 9 was tiny and tucked into a corner. Voting was not secret. SA and SS men observed the polling stations, assisting voters, and taking note of any who seemed hesitant. All Jews, Roma, and other undesirables, as well as all political prisoners, were forbidden from voting. The result, announced to the world, was a triumphant 99.73% in Austria and 99.08% in Germany in favor of the reunification. The sham was transparent, but in the new reality of 1,938, it was a powerful propaganda victory, allowing Hitler to claim he had acted not as a conqueror, but as the agent of the popular will. The consequences of the Anschluss were immediate and catastrophic. Strategically, Germany had been transformed. It had absorbed 6.5 million new citizens and the significant industrial, timber, and agricultural resources of Austria. The Austrian National Bank's gold and foreign currency reserves were promptly transferred to Berlin, financing the Wehrmacht's rearmament. The Austrian army, with its 6 divisions, was absorbed into the German military, adding valuable manpower, particularly in mountain warfare. But the most devastating consequence was geographical. By annexing Austria, Hitler had not just gained a province, he had gained a strategic dagger. The nation of Czechoslovakia, the next target on his list, had built its formidable border defenses, the Czech Maginot Line, to face Germany to the north and west. Now, with Austria in German hands, Czechoslovakia's southern border was wide open and indefensible. The country was encircled, caught in the jaws of the wolf. The Anschluss was the true beginning of the Second World War in Europe. It was not the first act of fascist aggression, but it was the first to tear up the borders of the Versailles settlement in the heart of Europe. It proved to Hitler conclusively that his instincts were correct. He had gambled, and the small, weak-kneed men of his own general staff, who had feared war, were wrong. He had gambled, and the decadent, fearful democracies of Britain and France had flinched. Appeasement was not a policy he had to fight. It was a weakness he could exploit. The lesson he learned from Austria was simple. Boldness would be rewarded, and violence worked. The lesson the Western powers learned was the opposite. They believed that by sacrificing Austria, they had avoided a wider war. They hoped that, with the German question of Austria finally settled, Hitler might be satisfied. This fundamental, tragic misunderstanding of their adversary set the stage for the next crisis, the crisis over the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, which would come just 5 months later. The annexation of Austria was far more than a political union. It was a test of will, a test of military logistics, and a test of international morality. The Wehrmacht learned it needed to fix its fuel lines. The SS learned how to efficiently terrorize and dispossess a population. The Western Allies learned that they were not, in the end, willing to fight for a faraway country of which they knew little. And for the people of Austria, the cheers of the Heldenplatz were the overture to 7 years of darkness, a darkness that would consume their homeland and, in time, the entire continent.